Most people think childhood disappears slowly, a birthday at a time, a school year at a time. But in Petaluma, innocence vanished in a single night because a 12-year-old girl named Polly Klaas was taken from her own bedroom during a sleepover. While her friends listened helplessly in the dark, and after that happened, parents across America started checking locks twice before going to bed. So here's the question that still terrifies people decades later. If a child wasn't safe in her own home, then where was she safe at all? Before we go on, there's something you need to understand. Stories like this aren't just content. They're real lives, real families, and real pain that didn't end when the headlines faded. If you are here just for entertainment, you might want to think about that for a second, because every time you watch a story like this and move on without supporting the channel, you're basically saying these cases don't matter enough to be told properly. Now, if you want more deep, detailed, cold cases like this, told with the full story, not rushed summaries, then this is exactly what this channel is built for. So go ahead and subscribe, turn on post notifications, not for me, but for the stories that still deserve to be heard. The night in Petaluma started like any other night in a quiet American neighborhood. Lights on in living rooms, kids laughing, doors left unlocked without a second thought. Inside one of those homes was a 12-year-old girl, Polly Klaas. She wasn't alone. She had friends over for a sleepover. The kind of night parents don't overthink. The kind of night that is supposed to feel safe by default. Pillows on the floor, talking late into the night. The feeling that nothing outside that house mattered, and for hours, nothing did. But what makes this story terrifying is not what happened immediately. It's how normal everything stayed. Right up until it wasn't. There was no warning sign that would stand out in memory later. No dramatic moment where someone knew something was wrong. Just the quiet rhythm of a house settling into the night. Then, sometime after dark, that rhythm broke. A man entered the home, not through imagination, not through rumor, but physically, into a space where children were sleeping. What happened next would later be described in fragments, because fear doesn't form clean sentences when you're living through it. There was confusion, there was restraint, and then there was silence where there shouldn't have been silence. 2 children were still inside that room, and they would survive that night, but what they witnessed would never leave them. Within minutes, Polly Klaas was gone, not missing in theory, not possibly outside somewheres. Gone from inside her own bedroom, during a sleepover, in a town that thought nothing like this could happen there. And by the time anyone understood what had just occurred, the entire meaning of safety in that town had already changed. The first calls didn't sound like a catastrophe. They sounded confused. A child was missing. Maybe she wandered off. Maybe she was outside. Maybe she'd just gone somewhere she wasn't supposed to. But inside the home in Petaluma, nothing about that explanation felt right, because 2 children were still there, and they knew something the adults didn't yet understand. When officers arrived at the home of Polly Klaas, they weren't walking into a clear crime scene. They were walking into fragments, a disturbed bedroom, confused adults, a silence that felt heavier than noise. There was no obvious sign of forced explanation at first glance, no clean story the way investigators prefer to find one early on. Just the unsettling feeling that something had broken inside the normal order of things. And then they met the girls who had been in the room. The 2 children who had been tied up were alive. But survival didn't mean clarity. their account came in pieces. A man entered the room, a knife, orders being given. Fear was so intense, it blurred time. And then the most important detail, the one that made everything collapse into certainty. They described watching their friend being taken. Not imagined, not assumed, taken. At that moment, the investigation stopped being about a missing child. It became something else entirely. A confirmed abduction. News spreads differently in small communities. It doesn't explode immediately. It leaks from officer to dispatcher, from dispatcher to neighbor, from neighbor to street. And suddenly, the idea that she might be nearby starts dissolving, because now people understand. This wasn't a child who got lost. This was a child who was taken. And once that realization settles in, the emotional tone of the entire town changes. Doors start locking earlier. Phones start ringing more often. Parents start pulling children closer without saying why. By nightfall, the search expands. Flashlights cut through yards. Cars move slowly through quiet streets. Volunteers begin to gather without being told what to do. And somewhere in that growing chaos, a father begins repeating the same question over and over again. Where is she? But what no one is ready to say out loud yet is the part that makes this case different from ordinary missing person reports. There are cases where time helps, and there are cases where time is already running out. By the time the search fully organizes itself, the situation involving Polly Klaas has already shifted beyond hope of a simple explanation. Somewhere out there, a child is no longer just missing, and the town is about to learn that finding her will require facing something far more disturbing than they expected, because the person who took her wasn't far away, and he was still moving. By the next morning, what happened in Petaluma was no longer just a local emergency. It had become something America couldn't look away from, because a 12-year-old girl, Polly Klaas, was now the face of every parent's worst fear. And once her photo hit the national news cycle, everything changed. Television networks picked up the case almost immediately. A missing child, a home invasion, 2 surviving witnesses. It had all the elements that made America stop scrolling, stop flipping channels, and start paying attention. Within hours, her face was on screens across the country. Her name was being repeated in newsrooms. Her story was spreading faster than official updates could control. And suddenly, this wasn't just a missing child in California. It was a national emergency of emotion. Volunteers started arriving in waves, not organized groups at first, just people, students, parents, strangers who had never met her. They spread out into wooded areas, empty lots, back roads, neighborhoods that suddenly felt unfamiliar in daylight. Every direction looked like a possibility, and none of them felt like an answer. And the longer the search went on, the heavier the silence became, because hope doesn't disappear instantly. It drains slowly. At the center of it all was her father, Mark Klaas, and he was no longer speaking privately. He was speaking to the entire country. In interviews, his voice carried something that news anchors didn't know how to handle. Not just grief, but disbelief, because he kept returning to the same idea. How does a child vanish from her own home during a sleepover in a place like this? And the more he spoke, the more uncomfortable the truth became for viewers watching at home. This wasn't a distant tragedy anymore. It was a question every parent started asking in silence. Something subtle began happening across America. Parents didn't just watch the coverage, they reacted to it, checking doors twice, calling children inside earlier. Because the story wasn't just about what happened to Polly. It was about what people now realized could happen anywhere. even in homes that felt safe, even in towns that felt untouched, even on nights that started completely normal. As the search for Polly Klaas stretched on, one truth began forming beneath all the noise. There were thousands of people looking. There were cameras everywhere. There was national attention, but none of it had brought her closer. And somewhere in the background of all that effort, the person responsible was still unknown, still unlocated, still out there. At first, the investigation into Polly Klaas didn't have a face. It had fragments, a description, a direction of escape, a growing sense that whoever did this didn't behave like a first-time offender. And that detail changed everything. Because experienced violence leaves patterns behind. They weren't just asking what happened anymore. They were asking, who moves like this? Who enters a home like that? Who controls a situation involving children without hesitation? The answers weren't comforting because the behavior pointed away from randomness and toward repetition, someone who had done this before, or something close to it. As pressure intensified, a suspect began to emerge from the background of unrelated reports, a man moving through California's system with a long history of arrests, a man familiar with law enforcement databases, a man who had been in and out of custody more than once. Then a name surfaced, Richard Allen Davis. At first, it didn't land as the answer. It landed as a possibility, and possibilities are dangerous in cases like this because they force investigators to recheck everything they thought they understood. The more officers looked into him, the more disturbing the pattern became. This wasn't someone unknown to the system. This was someone moving through it, a repeat offender with prior violent behavior, a man with a documented criminal history that raised immediate concern in hindsight. And suddenly, the investigation shifted from, who did this, to something far more uncomfortable. How was this man even available to do it? Because now the case wasn't only about finding a missing child. It was about exposure. If Davis was involved, then the story didn't start on the night of the abduction. It started long before that, in parole decisions, in prior arrests, in moments where consequences should have held, but didn't. And that realization created a second wave of anger across the investigation, not just at the crime, but at the system that allowed proximity to it. As more records surfaced, investigators began building a clearer picture of Richard Allen Davis, not a mystery figure, a known one, a man with a history that included repeated encounters with law enforcement, enough to suggest escalation over time, not sudden collapse. And that detail made the case even more chilling, because it meant this wasn't a story about a single moment of darkness. It was a story about a pattern that had been allowed to continue. By the time the name Richard Allen Davis fully entered the investigation, the emotional tone of the case had already shifted again, because now people weren't only asking where Polly was, they were asking something heavier. How long had this man been dangerous before anyone started paying attention? And the answer to that question was about to take the investigation somewhere even darker, because identifying him was only the beginning. Finding what he did next was still ahead. What makes the case of Polly Klaas so hard to sit with isn't just what happened. It's everything that came before it that people only notice when it's already too late. A system that missed signs, a pattern that was ignored, a child who was taken from a place everyone assumed was safe. And the uncomfortable truth is, stories like this only stay alive when people refuse to let them fade into background noise. So if you're watching this because you care about what really happened, not just the headline, but the reality behind it. Subscribe, because these cases don't stay alive on their own. And if you're not going to subscribe, don't just scroll past. Go to the comments and say why, because silence is exactly how stories like this get forgotten. What made this phase so disturbing in hindsight wasn't one single mistake. It was how close things came, repeatedly, without crossing the finish line. At different points in the early investigation, officers were tracking movements that aligned with suspicious activity. Patrols were covering areas where the suspect had already passed through, and fragmented information was being processed in different directions at once. No one had the full picture yet, and that's what made it dangerous. Because the truth was already moving, and the system was still assembling the question. As attention narrowed on Davis, something unsettling became clear. He wasn't stationary. He was moving through areas that were being searched, around people who didn't yet know who he was, and past moments where a different timeline could have formed entirely. But every time the investigation tightened in one direction, another piece of information lagged just behind it. Not wrong, just delayed. And in cases like this, delay is everything. Inside law enforcement, the emotional weight was starting to show. This wasn't a routine missing person case anymore. It had become a race against time with no visible finish line. Officers weren't just working harder, they were working under the awareness that every decision now carried irreversible consequences because everyone understood the same possibility. If they were wrong at any step, the window might close completely. There's a specific kind of tension in investigations like this. Not chaos, not clarity, but something in between. Clues that feel connected, but not yet confirmed. Names that surface before context catches up. Patterns that only make sense when it's already too late to act differently. And in the search for Polly Klaas, that tension was building every hour. As more leads were reviewed, frustration began to replace uncertainty because investigators could feel it. They were close, not to close, but to something that would explain everything. And that feeling is dangerous in its own way because it creates urgency without certainty, pressure without resolution, motion without arrival. By this stage, the investigation wasn't scattered anymore. It was converging on a name, on a pattern, on a man who had already been moving long before he was understood to be the center of the case. And as pressure reached its peak, the case was about to shift again, from searching to confrontation. By this point in the search for Polly Klaas, something strange was happening across Petaluma and beyond. The entire world was looking outward, into forests, into neighborhoods, into every possible hiding place. But the person investigators were closing in on wasn't just moving through space. He was also watching. As the case grew, news coverage intensified. Her face appeared everywhere. Her name was repeated constantly. Search efforts became national headlines, and somewhere inside that media storm was a detail that investigators later reflected on with unease. Richard Allen Davis was aware of what was happening, not removed from it, not disconnected from it, inside it. On one side, a father publicly pleading for his daughter, Mark Klaas, speaking to cameras with a breaking voice, trying to hold on to hope that was slipping faster each day. Volunteers searching until exhaustion. Police expanding operations. A country emotionally attached to a missing child. And on the other side, someone believed to be connected to the disappearance, quietly observing the reaction it created. The grief, the urgency. The fear spread through households that had never met her. Two realities, one public, one hidden. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that a case can become entertainment to the person responsible for it, not in a theatrical sense, but in a psychological one, because it creates a mirror effect. Every news report confirms impact. Every search confirms attention. Every emotional interview confirms the consequence. And instead of distance, it creates awareness. What investigators struggled with emotionally wasn't just what Davis allegedly did. It was what he seemed to understand about the situation while remaining unseen. A paradox forms here. The more the world searched for answers, the more visible the impact became, while the source of that impact remained unexposed. And that imbalance creates fear that spreads beyond the case itself. By now, the search for Polly Klaas had become something larger than a missing person case. It was a shared emotional event. People who had never been to Petaluma were emotionally invested. Strangers felt connected to her story. Parents saw their own children in the coverage. And all the while, the person at the center of suspicion was still not publicly confirmed in full detail, still not confronted, still not resolved, just present in the background of everything unfolding. By this stage, the emotional pressure of the case had reached a point where silence felt heavier than information, because everyone could sense it now. The search wasn't drifting anymore. It was narrowing towards someone who had been there the entire time. And what happens next is not discovery, it's contact. By now, the search for Polly Klaas had reached a breaking point. Too many hours, too many leads, too many fragments that almost connected, but didn't. And in cases like this, there is always a moment when pressure stops building outward and collapses inward. Investigators working the case began tightening their focus on Richard Allen Davis, not because of a single dramatic revelation, but because of something more reliable. Evidence. A fingerprint recovered during the investigation was submitted for comparison. At first, it was just another routine verification step, the kind of process that happens in hundreds of cases, without consequence. But this time, it didn't come back empty. The result confirmed what investigators had been circling for days. The print matched Davis, and suddenly, everything that had been uncertain was no longer theoretical. This was no longer suspected. It was identification. The case had a direction now, and once that happens, everything speeds up. Law enforcement moved quickly. Davis was located and taken into custody. No dramatic chase, no public spectacle, just a controlled arrest built on accumulating certainty. And for the first time since the night she disappeared, the investigation stopped being about searching outward. It became about what he knew. Because arrests don't end cases like this. They change the question. Now it wasn't, where is she? It was, what happened? Investigators now had access to the one person who had been closest to the truth from the very beginning. And that is where cases like this become darker, not lighter. Even with an arrest made, there was no sense of closure, because an arrest only answers identity, not an outcome, not the truth, not recovery. And as investigators prepared for what came next, a new realization began to form quietly in the background. This part of the case was only the surface, and as the weight of the arrest settled over the investigation involving Polly Klaas, one truth remained unspoken inside the system. But the worst part of the story was still coming. After the arrest of Richard Allen Davis, the investigation into the disappearance of Polly Klaas entered its most devastating phase. Because arresting someone doesn't bring relief. It brings answers, and sometimes those answers are worse than silence. During interrogation, Davis began to speak. not in fragments of denial, not in confusion, but in detail. He described the sequence of events from that night in Petaluma, how he entered the home, how the situation escalated, and how quickly control was taken. Each detail confirmed what investigators had already feared. This was not random chaos. It was a deliberate action. And with each sentence, the space for uncertainty disappeared. Then came the part no one wanted to reach. Davis led authorities to the truth of what happened after the abduction. The search for Polly did not end with discovery. It ended with confirmation. Polly Klaas was no longer a missing person, and for the people who had spent weeks searching, hoping, and refusing to accept the worst, that realization landed like silence that refuses to break. Her remains were eventually located in a rural area. There was no dramatic final scene, no reunion, no rescue, no reversal of time, just the end of a search that had carried an entire community emotionally for weeks. And that is what made it so devastating. Because recovery doesn't always feel like resolution. Sometimes it feels like confirmation of loss. When the news reached the public, it didn't arrive by shock alone. It arrived as exhaustion. Families who had followed every update, volunteers who had searched every field, officers who had held on to possibility longer than logic allowed. All of them were forced to adjust to a reality they had avoided naming out loud, and at that moment, the case stopped being an investigation. It became a national grief event. What made the story of Polly Klaas so unforgettable wasn't only what happened, it was where it happened, inside a home, during a sleepover, in a place that was supposed to represent safety without question. And once that illusion breaks, it doesn't repair easily. By the time the confession was complete and the recovery confirmed, the case had reached its factual endpoint. But emotionally, it was just beginning to spread outward, because now America wasn't searching anymore. It was absorbing what the search had uncovered, and what came next would change how a generation thought about safety, justice, and childhood itself. What happened in the case of Polly Klaas isn't just another true crime story you scroll past and forget. It's a reminder of how fragile safety can be, even in places that were supposed to feel untouchable. And the hardest part is this: people followed this case, watched the updates, hoped for a different outcome, and still ended up here. So if you're still watching, don't treat this like background noise. Like the video if you think stories like this should stay remembered, not buried. Share it if you think more people need to understand how quickly innocence can disappear when warning signs are ignored. And if you're not going to do either, then ask yourself what made you stop here in the first place, and leave that in the comments. By the time the case of Polly Klaas reached court, the search was over. The questions were no longer about where she was. They were about what justice would look like now that everything was confirmed. And inside the courtroom, in Petaluma's wider public sphere of attention, one figure stood at the center of it all: Richard Allen Davis. Courtrooms are supposed to be controlled spaces, quiet, structured, measured. But this case wasn't emotionally controlled anymore. It was saturated. Families filled the room. Reporters packed every available angle, and behind every face in that courtroom was the same thing: unanswered grief, trying not to become rage. What struck observers most wasn't just the testimony or the evidence being reviewed. It was Davis himself. Richard Allen Davis appeared detached from the emotional weight surrounding him. While the courtroom processed details of a child's disappearance and death, his behavior was described by many as disturbingly indifferent, and that contrast created something powerful in the room. a sense that two realities were existing at the same time, one filled with grief, one seemingly untouched by it. Outside the courthouse, the reaction intensified, because for the public, this wasn't just legal proceedings anymore. It was accountability unfolding in real time. The more details that emerged about the case of Polly Klaas, the more anger built toward the man at its center, not just for what happened, but for what people believed should have never been possible in the first place. Over time, Davis stopped being viewed only as a defendant. He became a symbol of failure, of anger, of a system that had allowed repeated opportunities for violence to escalate. And once a case becomes symbolic, emotion stops being individual. It becomes collective. Most cases slowly leave public attention. This one didn't, because it didn't just create grief. It created lasting distrust. Parents didn't just mourn what happened to Polly. They questioned what could have prevented it. And that question doesn't close neatly in a courtroom. By the end of the proceedings involving Richard Allen Davis, there was legal closure, but emotionally the room was still heavy, because even with evidence, confession, and conviction, nothing in that courtroom could reverse what had already happened. And that realization set the stage for something bigger than the trial itself. It set the stage for change. The case of Polly Klaas didn't end when the trial ended. It ended when the entire country started changing how it defines safety. Because what happened in Petaluma didn't stay in Petaluma. It spread outward into laws, habits, and fear that reshaped everyday life. In the aftermath of the case, political pressure intensified across California. The name Richard Allen Davis became central in public debate, not just as an individual case, but as an example people pointed to when demanding change. That pressure helped fuel support for what became known as the 3 Strikes Law, a major shift in sentencing policy aimed at repeat offenders. For supporters, the logic was simple. If someone with a long, violent history had been out in society, something had to change so it couldn't happen again. For critics, it opened a much larger debate about justice, punishment, and scale. But regardless of position, one fact was clear. This case has changed the legal conversation in America. But laws weren't the only thing that changed. Behavior did too. After the case of Polly Klaas, parenting in America subtly shifted. Not overnight, but permanently. Sleepovers became more carefully checked. Neighborhood freedom became more restricted. Trust in safe places started to weaken, because the assumption that danger was always outside the home had been broken. In Petaluma, the change was even more personal. This wasn't just a national policy discussion. It was a living memory. People who grew up there after the case often describe a quiet before and after feeling in the town's identity. Parks didn't feel the same. Neighbors didn't feel the same. Even ordinary evenings carried a different awareness. Not constant fear, but I changed my mind. What made this case endure wasn't only the crime itself. It was how many systems it touched at once. Criminal justice, media coverage, community behavior, parenting culture, national legislation. A single night became a reference point for national anxiety. And over time, the name Polly Klaas stopped being just a case file. It became a warning that shaped decisions long after the headlines faded. For many Americans, the murder of Polly Klaas was the moment childhood stopped feeling untouchable. A little girl disappeared from a bedroom during a sleepover, and after that night, parents across the country started checking locks twice, not because they were paranoid, because they now knew it could happen, anywhere. like Polly Klaas, don't stay alive on their own. They fade when people stop talking about them. They disappear when attention moves on. And what gets lost with them is everything they tried to warn us about. Not just what happened that night in Petaluma, but all the moments leading up to it that were only understood clearly after it was too late. So if you're watching this because you don't want stories like this to be forgotten, subscribe, not for entertainment, not for noise, but to keep these cases remembered for what they actually are. And if this case affected you in a way you didn't expect, don't just scroll past. Tell me why in the comments.